He only said it once, but it landed like something final. "I want a divorce, Vivienne." Vivienne Alcott set down her coffee cup carefully, the way you do when your hands have started to shake, but you don't want anyone to see. She looked at her husband of 7 years, at Rowan Beckett, with his jaw set and his eyes already somewhere else, and she understood in that terrible clarifying way that he had made this decision long before he said it out loud. "When?" she asked, because that was the only question she could manage. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." The kitchen felt suddenly too bright. Morning light through the window over the sink, the smell of toast she hadn't eaten, the hum of the refrigerator that had needed replacing for 2 years. She had meant to deal with that. She had meant to deal with a lot of things. "Is there someone else?" He didn't answer right away. That was its own kind of answer. Her name was Tara. Vivienne would find that out later, through a mutual friend who felt too guilty to stay quiet. Tara Weston, 31, an acquisitions analyst at the firm, where Rowan had been made partner 11 months ago. Vivienne remembered that night, the celebration dinner at a restaurant she'd had to look up the dress code for, the champagne that made her dizzy because she hadn't eaten enough, the way Rowan had laughed with his colleagues and looked, for once, like someone whose life was going exactly as planned. She had been so happy for him. That was the part that would stay with her the longest. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Vivienne had hired a lawyer, a composed woman named Patricia Hennessy, who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of this story and felt no need to perform shock. Patricia told her what to expect, walked her through the documents, and never once said anything that could be mistaken for pity, which Vivienne appreciated more than she could express. What Patricia did not know, what Vivienne herself did not know until the 3rd week of November, was that the settlement documents Rowan's lawyer had prepared contained a clause Vivienne had not been fully briefed on, a property clause, buried in the financial disclosure appendix, that effectively transferred the equity interest in a small investment property in Whistler, that Vivienne had purchased with inheritance money before the marriage. Her own money, premarital. It should not have been included, but she was exhausted by then. She had stopped sleeping properly. She had started losing weight in that unconscious way that happens when grief makes eating feel like an effort. She signed where Patricia pointed and trusted that the important things had been caught. She would not discover what had been missed until much later. The day the divorce was finalized, Vivienne drove to her mother's house in Oakville and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Her mother, Elaine, opened the door before she'd even reached the step, because Elaine had always been like that, always watching, always ready, and didn't say anything, just held the door open wide. They drank tea at the kitchen table. Outside, a November rain came down in the gray, persistent way it does in southern Ontario when the season has fully committed to itself. "You'll stay for a few days," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "I have work Monday. You'll stay for the weekend then?" Vivienne nodded and looked out the window and felt, underneath the wreckage of the past 4 months, something she couldn't name yet. Not relief exactly. Not grief exactly. Something quieter than both. She was 37 years old. She had spent 7 years building a life around someone else's ambitions. She had deferred her own promotion twice because Rowan's schedule didn't accommodate the travel. She had moved apartments when he wanted to be closer to the financial district. She had smiled at his colleagues' wives at dinners, where she knew almost no one, and pretended she didn't notice how quickly the conversation moved on from her. She had done all of this willingly. That was the thing she kept returning to in those long, wakeful hours after midnight. She had chosen it over and over, convinced herself it was partnership, convinced herself it would be reciprocal eventually. She learned 2 months after the divorce that she was pregnant. She sat on the edge of the bathtub in her rented apartment in Hamilton. She'd had to give up the Toronto place, part of the financial recalibration that came with suddenly being a single income, and she held the test and looked at it for a very long time. Her first coherent thought was, he doesn't know. Her second thought was, I'm not going to tell him, not yet, not until she understood what she wanted, what she was going to do, what the shape of this was going to be. She owed him nothing but honesty, and she would be honest eventually. But she needed a few days first to understand what she was feeling, to let it settle, to decide who she was going to be on the other side of this. She called her mother. She cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since the divorce, the ugly, helpless kind that comes from somewhere past the point of control. Elaine drove from Oakville that night, arriving just before 10 with a container of soup and a kind of steady, unshowy presence that Vivian had spent her whole life underestimating and now understood was one of the most valuable things a person could offer. "He'll want to know eventually," her mother said. "I know. Are you going to tell him?" "When I'm ready. When I know what I'm asking for." What Vivian did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Rowan Beckett's life was already beginning to come apart in ways that had nothing to do with her. The firm where he'd made partner was under regulatory scrutiny. A complaint had been filed with the Ontario Securities Commission related to undisclosed conflicts of interest in a series of private equity transactions. The name attached to the complaint, the name of the person accused of structuring the problematic transactions, was Rowan's. His lawyer would later argue, convincingly, that the source code from the firm's trading platform had been accessed using Rowan's credentials, but not by Rowan himself, that someone had used his login during a period when he'd been traveling, that the timestamps didn't align with his documented travel schedule. That argument would take 18 months to fully make. In the meantime, the partnership was suspended. The engagement announcement he'd made with Tara Weston, which had appeared in a lifestyle column Vivian's colleague had shown her, with the particular discomfort of someone delivering bad news they can't help being a little interested in. That engagement quietly dissolved as well. Vivian learned about the investigation from the news, like everyone else. She was 6 months pregnant by then. She was also, in a development that surprised her more than perhaps it should have, being headhunted for a senior director position at a wealth management firm based in Toronto. A firm she'd interviewed with 3 years ago, before the second deferral, before she'd convinced herself the timing wasn't right. They'd kept her file. They'd reached out again. She told them she was pregnant. They said they wanted to schedule a second conversation anyway. His name was Fletcher Ossie, and she crossed that name off immediately because she'd seen it in a list somewhere. No, she needed to be careful here. The man who would change what came next was named Theodore Crane, not Ted, Theodore. He was precise about it in that way that isn't quite vanity, but is close to it. The way a person is precise about small things, when the large things in their life have been put carefully in order. He was 43. He had made his money in infrastructure development, specifically in sustainable transit projects, across 3 provinces and 1 territory, and he lived with the particular self-possession of someone who had built something real and didn't need to explain it to anyone. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, to a woman he still spoke well of, which Vivian would later decide was one of the more telling things about him. She met him at a fundraiser for a community legal clinic in Hamilton. The kind of event where you go because a friend insisted and you spend the first 40 minutes wondering why you came, and then end up staying until the very end. Vivian had come because her friend Dana had organized the silent auction and needed bodies. Vivian was 7 months pregnant and self-conscious about it in crowds, but Dana had promised her a corner seat and a direct line to the food. Theodore Crane was at the table next to hers. He had come, she would learn later, because the clinic had represented his mother in a tenant dispute 15 years ago, and he had never forgotten it. He noticed her. Not in the aggressive way that made her tired, the way some men look at pregnant women as though the pregnancy is a conversation piece, a curiosity. He noticed her the way a person notices someone who seems slightly outside the room they're physically in, somewhere else in their head, working through something. "Is the salmon good?" he asked, a genuinely useless question. She had been pushing it around her plate. "It's fine," she said, and then, because she was too tired to perform social niceties at the level they usually required, "I'm not really hungry. I came because a friend needed warm bodies for the count." He laughed, not a polished laugh, a real one. They talked for an hour and a half. About the clinic, about Hamilton, about a book they'd both read and disagreed on in specific, interesting ways. He did not ask about the pregnancy once. When the event ended and Dana appeared to drag Vivian into the coat queue, Theodore Crane handed her a business card and said, with the directness she would come to recognize as just how he operated, "I'd like to take you for coffee sometime. When you have the bandwidth." She thought about it for 2 days. Then she texted, She had twins at 38 weeks, a boy and a girl, both healthy, both loud, both absolutely destroying her sleep schedule, in a way she would not have traded for anything. The birth was longer than she'd wanted and shorter than she'd feared, and her mother was in the room and held her hand through the worst of it, and when the babies were placed on her chest, one after the other, Vivian felt something she had no adequate word for. Not happiness exactly. Something older than happiness. Some version of certainty. She named them Audrey and James. She told Rowan about the pregnancy from a hospital room, 26 hours after the birth, when she had slept enough to be coherent. It was the most difficult phone call she had ever made. Not because she was afraid of him. She had stopped being afraid of his reaction somewhere around month 5. But because she was telling him something that would change the shape of his life, and she understood the weight of that. Even when she had no feeling left for the person receiving it. He was silent for a long time. "They're mine," he said finally. "Not a question." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "I'll need to meet them. When you're ready to discuss custody appropriately, you can reach me through my lawyer." She hung up before he could respond. She looked at Audrey asleep in the bassinet, and James asleep on her chest, his small, improbable weight, and she breathed. What Rowan did next was not what she expected. He did not call his lawyer immediately. He did not, in the first week, do much of anything useful. He was still dealing with the regulatory investigation, still dealing with the slow public unraveling of a partnership that had defined the last 2 years of his life. When he did finally contact Patricia Hennessy's office, it was not with the aggressive posture she'd braced for. It was, by Patricia's account, almost subdued. He wanted access. He wanted to be part of his children's lives. What he discovered, when his lawyer reviewed the settlement agreement more carefully than anyone had apparently bothered to at the time, was the custody provision that had been included in the final documents. A provision he had not noticed. A provision his own lawyer had apparently described as standard language. It was not standard language. It was language that, given Vivian's circumstances and the specifics of the children's birth timing, significantly limited his ability to demand immediate joint custody. He had signed it. His lawyer had signed off on it. It had simply been there in the document, and no one had flagged it. Vivian had not put it there. She had not known it was there. Patricia Hennessy told her, with professional composure, that the clause existed and that it worked in Vivian's favor, and that they should not draw attention to it unless challenged. Vivian sat with that information for 3 days. Then she called Patricia and told her to prepare for a co-parenting agreement, something fair and workable, and to reach out to Rowan's legal team directly. She did not want to win because of a clause. She wanted to win because the right structure had been built, because Audrey and James would grow up with 2 parents who had, whatever else had happened between them, figured out how to be decent to each other, for the sake of 2 small people who had done nothing wrong. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't the absence of grief. It was something more practical than either, and she had decided that practical was enough. Practical was, in fact, more than enough. Practical was what her children were going to need, and she had always been, when she allowed herself to be, extremely good at it. Theodore came to the hospital on the 3rd day. He brought food from a restaurant she'd mentioned once in passing 3 months earlier, and she noted that he had remembered, though she didn't say so. He sat across from her in the visitor's chair and looked at Audrey in the bassinet with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and genuine, and said nothing for a while. "They're extraordinary," he said eventually. "They're very small and they make alarming sounds," she said. "That's what I mean." She laughed for the first time since the birth. Real laughter, not the polite kind. He stayed for 2 hours. He didn't try to make it more than what it was. He helped her with the food packaging when she couldn't manage the container with one hand, passed her things when she needed them, and left when her mother arrived and needed the chair. At the door he paused. "I'll be around," he said, "whatever that means to you." She had learned by then to recognize when someone was telling the truth. The regulatory case against Rowan was resolved, eventually, the way these things often are, not with a vindication but with a settlement, a censure, a mandatory period of supervised practice. His lawyers succeeded in demonstrating that the transactions had been structured by someone else using his access, though the question of who exactly and why was never cleanly answered. There were names floated. There were suggestions of a rival within the firm who had seen an opportunity and taken it. Nothing was proven to the satisfaction of a court. He came back. Not to Tara, that was finished, and not to Vivienne. He came back to a smaller practice, a different kind of work, and slowly and with more effort than he had ever applied to fatherhood before, to Audrey and James. The first handoff was awkward. They met in the lobby of a building neither of them had any connection to, which Patricia had suggested as neutral ground. Vivienne had dressed with the same care she brought to difficult presentations. Rowan looked like someone who had recently lost weight, and not entirely on purpose. They passed the children between them with the careful attention of people who have both agreed, without saying it, that the children are the only thing that matters now. Thank you, he said at the end of it. Not for a specific thing. For all of it, she understood. Be good to them, she said, and went to her car and drove to her mother's house and ate soup and did not fall apart, which felt, that evening, like the most significant achievement of her life. She took the director position. She moved back to Toronto, a different neighborhood, a different apartment, better light than the Hamilton place had ever offered. She hired a nanny, a practical woman named Colette Marsh, who had 4 decades of experience and no interest in being anyone's friend, which suited Vivienne perfectly. She bought a coffee maker that actually worked. She found a dry cleaner within walking distance. She began, piece by piece, to build the life she hadn't known she was missing. Theodore took her to dinner the first time in April, when the twins were 4 months old, and she had slept enough consecutive hours to remember what it felt like to be fully present in a room. He chose somewhere quiet. He did not pretend the evening was casual when it wasn't. He had, she was coming to understand, a useful allergy to pretense. I should tell you, she said, over the main course, that I'm still figuring out who I am after all of this. I don't know what it means for whatever this is. He considered this with the same deliberateness he seemed to bring to most things. I'm not in a hurry, he said. That might change. It might. I'll let you know if it does. She appreciated the honesty enough to stop apologizing for the uncertainty. The property in Whistler, the one she'd signed away without realizing, the inheritance property, resurfaced 18 months after the divorce, during a routine review of her financial portfolio that her new firm's internal advisor had flagged. Patricia Hennessy was not surprised. She had suspected for some time that the clause had not been an oversight. Someone had known what they were including. Someone had understood exactly what that property represented. The evidence trail was administrative, flagged by a file audit during the firm's own internal review of the settlement. It pointed to a third-party paralegal who had worked on Rowan's legal team. Whether Rowan had known about it was a question that never received a clean answer, and Vivienne, after a long conversation with Patricia and a longer one with herself, decided she did not need one. The property was recovered. The paralegal no longer worked in law. Whatever else had happened in that room, between those documents, was finished. She did not call Rowan to tell him what had been found. She did not want that conversation, did not want to reopen the question of what he had or hadn't known. She simply filed the papers, recovered the asset, and put it in a trust she set up for Audrey and James. Elaine drove up from Oakville the weekend after everything was resolved. They walked along the waterfront, the twins in the stroller, absurdly large now, all eyes and will and grabbing hands, and the spring light doing what it does in Toronto when it finally commits, the lake going silver blue to the horizon. Are you happy? Her mother asked. Vivienne thought about it seriously, because Elaine was not someone who asked questions she didn't want real answers to. I'm getting there, she said. I think that's enough. Elaine nodded. She had raised Vivienne to understand that enough is not a defeat. That sometimes enough is exactly the right amount of something, arrived at the right time. Audrey pointed at a duck and made a sound of absolute conviction. James looked at his sister and laughed. That new laugh, the one that had appeared in the 3rd month, and still startled Vivienne with its fullness, its certainty that laughter was appropriate, that the world had offered something worth responding to. She put her hand on the stroller bar and kept walking. There would be more to figure out. There would be harder days and better ones. There would be co-parenting negotiations and school decisions, and moments when she would still feel the shape of what had been taken from her. The years, the deferred choices, the self she had set aside in increments, too small to notice at the time. She knew all of that was still coming. But the morning light was on the water, and her children were laughing, and the life she had nearly let herself stop wanting was here, and it was hers.